Hi, this is Siofra's Magick Alcove, and I'm Siofra Bradigan. So weirdly enough, I did an entire video on Tadare, and apparently it stopped recording right after I began talking. So apparently it didn't work out. So I'm going to try this again. Frustrating, to say the least, but maybe my thoughts will be more cohesive this second time around, or maybe not. So, Tadare, the idea of confronting the unknown with open eyes and an open heart and skepticism at the same time. It's sort of a combination of things. Because if you're going to stare down the universe and experience it in its most raw state, it takes courage, fortitude, and a willingness to make mistakes and trying not to judge what's coming based upon our human perceptions and conceptions of what exactly is the reality. The problem we have when we're starting this path, generally speaking, has to do with how we're raised, where we're raised, what we're taught, and what we have unconsciously chosen to believe and incorporate without even realizing that it's there. And when you first start along this path, you're going to come up against some of that kind of stuff. It's just going to hit you in the face. And a lot of times I call these challenges or tests or whatever. Some of them are more tests of like what kind of a path do you want to have, but a lot of them are just you confronting the fact that you don't really understand what's going on in the moment and it's confusing and why are you reacting the way you are. So having an open mind is kind of a paramount. Uh, it's a necessity in order to follow this kind of a path because we're starting off from a limited perceptual base. We've got a narrow field of vision, a narrow sense of hearing, so there's a lot of stuff that we can't hear and we can't see that happens around us all the time. We have a brain that's been programmed to eliminate certain things from your visual memory because through choices and input and so forth, the brain has determined that this is erroneous information and not helpful to your survival, therefore, not necessary for you to be able to perceive. And so it just doesn't show it to you at all. There's those weird ones like me and others like me that were born without the ability to turn that off, at least not completely. And so this other part of reality keeps impinging itself upon our consciousness no matter how much we try to avoid it. And for those like me, discernment is extremely important because you have to make choices about how to react to the input that you're getting and whether or not it's input that's useful or not useful and what you're going to do with it. So, being able to look within yourself and figure out what it is that assumptions you've made about the universe and how it works is kind of a requirement. It's vital to your development. If you don't know that you harbor this particular way of thinking, then you don't know that you're making decisions based on that unconscious ideal that you have, and it leads you in a different direction. I mean, it's like you can't you can't be a conscious co-creator and participant in the universe without being able to look at and root out those notions. So, trying to think of some different examples. My granddaughter and I were having a conversation the other day about Gandhi. She had looked at him when she was in school and found some stuff that upset her greatly about him as a person, and she didn't understand why people thought he was such a great guy because he was known to sleep naked with his naked nieces in the room with him in order to prove to himself that he was truly celibate because he didn't get aroused. And without any kind of cultural context or understanding of him as an individual, from our current perspective of how we view these things, he was a person who was in a position of authority and power, and if something bad had happened, nobody would probably believe the person who was a victim, although there's zero indication that anyone was victimized, I want to say. So, she has mentioned this to me on a number of occasions, and so I thought I should do a little bit of research on it myself, see if I could find out exactly, because I had not heard of it in particular, and found a pretty well done article about the subject, which helped to put it into perspective for me. And so, what I learned in the article was that when he was a young man, married to his wife, his father got sick, and one night he was making love to his wife, and his father died. So he wasn't there when his father died. And yeah, I believe that this set up a huge amount of guilt in him, and that he did the correlation causation jumping to conclusions here, that he was being punished somehow, or he'd done something wrong, he had failed on some level because he had succumbed to his carnal urges, and then not been there when his father died. Maybe he could have stopped him from dying. Who knows? All the different things that might have gone through his mind at the time. But it seems pretty clear that that was part of forming his attitude towards sex and celibacy and so forth. And then you take the piece of his religious inclinations, and a lot of the attitudes at the time, and in some places still, is that the losing of the seminal fluids is a weakening of the spirit, and if you're going to progress and become enlightened, you need to put those things aside and not succumb to physical urges, etc. And so the combination of those two things sort of met and became a bigger thing than either of them were maybe on their own. And he expressed his attitude towards this on numerous occasions, that he believed that sex was only for procreation, which is sort of a parochial notion to us in that sense. But it's certainly not, it seems weirdly familiar to a lot of fundamentalist Christianity and kind of thought processes and so forth. It's doesn't really seem too much different when it comes to that. So, because he accepted that as how reality works, and it became his reality, and therefore this exercise that he did with his nieces was to prove to himself that he had risen above carnal desire and no longer had that as an impediment to his spiritual growth. They did keep that out of the papers apparently at the time. They felt it was a private thing, and the newspapers in India did not mention it, probably because they felt it would be misunderstood by Westerners and the rest of the world, which undoubtedly it would have been, but and apparently still is. So that's a good example of how closely held experience belief combination can change in a fundamental way how you interact with the universe for the rest of your life. I read an autobiography about one Swami who had a bad experience. When he was 10, he lost a dog, his pet dog, and he wasn't prepared for the trauma, the grief that came along with it. And so that informed his belief system going forward where he looked to find ways to disassociate and unentangle himself emotionally from everyone around him, and got his followers to sort of believe the same thing, that that was the thing to do to avoid, in essence, the problem of having to grieve and missing someone when they're gone. You become unattached and accept the fact that everyone's going to die, and try not to like be too enmeshed emotionally in any one person, which I find a sad thing personally. But I remember that when we were seeing, Ian and I were seeing this acupuncturist who was a follower of this particular individual, which is where we got the book. I felt, you know, extremely distraught at the time, because what I got from all of the messaging and what the acupuncturist was saying was basically he believed that Ian and I should live in separate rooms and detach now, because eventually one of us is going to die before the other, so we might as well get that over with. And my interpretation was that he just didn't want Ian to care about me even after I died. And I was not happy. I was not happy with that way of thinking at all. I'm very emotion based, there's no doubt about it. And connections are important to me. And, you know, my choosing to be connected to the earth, to the planet, to living things, and so forth is the opposite of the idea of detachment and, you know, enlightenment, that kind of enlightenment. I think that there's different definitions for enlightenment, but that's definitely not my definition. But it does, it's another example of how somebody's experience, brief as it was, a single experience, informed the rest of his outlook for the rest of his life. And the ego's attempt to keep him right pulled everyone with him. No one could be around him if they didn't believe what he believed. That I see as an issue of ego in and of itself, because ego doesn't want to have dissent or questions coming at it, because then that shows cracks in the reality that has been created, and that means that you could be wrong, and not being right is one of the things ego won't allow. And certainly that's part of this thing, to dare to be able to make mistakes and not be right in order to learn actually new information. Because if you already figured it all out and you know exactly what's going on, you're doing something wrong on this path. Because it's a constant exploration of shifting reality and being able to adapt to shifting perspectives. So it's always funny doing this a second time, trying to remember what I said the first time that is gone forever, because we already passed through that moment and it went bye-bye. So in order to encounter the things that are out there, we have to be open-minded. That seems a given. I mean, if you're going to encounter the consciousness that's inside of a tree, you have to first accept the idea that a tree might have a form of consciousness. Because if you don't accept the possibility of it existing, there's no way you could actually experience it. Well, maybe you could, and then it would shock and completely destroy your entire reality, and you'd have to adapt or die. But generally speaking, it's easier if you accept the possibility first, rather than, you know, being bombarded by the actual reality of it without any preparation. And so the things that we think are true and aren't true definitely affect everything that we do and we experience. So one of the other things that came up this week, talking to my granddaughter, was this notion of polarity being a necessity in order for you. Her version of polarity was, in order to have joy and love, you have to experience pain and despair first, or as well. And it's only in the comparison between these two things that the one has more value. And I think that this is wrong thinking. And I talked to her about it, actually, and explained to her my reason for thinking that that was a bad idea. So here's my reason. For one thing, it limits us in our ability to actually transform ourselves and our society and the way we function as a civilization and a society. That we have this underlying belief that in order for people to have a good time and enjoy themselves, they also, some people at least, have got to have a terrible time to balance things out, that this is what that means. And here's what I think. I think we tell ourselves that, those of us who've had terrible things happen to us, for one. It is a way to try and make something positive out of something that isn't positive in any way whatsoever. That it made us stronger, it made us who we are, it makes us enjoy the good stuff better, because by contrast, we understand how good we actually have it. And all those ways of thinking about reality that then get us stuck in the notion that then the next time around we have to do that again. And in a way, it sort of dovetails into the thing about karma, the idea that you choose your parents and you choose your living situation, and somehow it's because you did something bad in a previous life and you have to make up for it in this one by having bad things happen to you, so that then you can move on, and that's the same thing, in my opinion. It's a way of trying to turn something that should never be and doesn't need to be into something positive, in the sense that it has a place in reality, and therefore we can make our peace with the fact that it exists in our own life and in other people's. And I think that's wrong. So in thinking about the idea of polarity, that's another one of those really often held beliefs, that good and evil exist in balance with one another, and one's always trying to outdo or over control or conquer the other. That there's this internal battle, not just in us, but in the universe itself, between good and evil. Bad things happen, good things happen, and all that jazz. And I think that that's another incorrect assumption that we make about reality and how it works. Yes, we have night and we have day, and they have different attributes. Without night, no one would ever rest. There would be no stars. I mean, the night is an integral part of our reality. We need it, the way our planet has evolved, and this is the planet we're on. And the day, if it was always daytime, no one would ever sleep and it would get too hot. I mean, it's like there is a balance there between coolness and quiet and light and activity and so forth, that is inherent in that sense. But it's not that one needs the other in like an ultimate kind of sense. It's like they just both exist. I mean, if you're out in space, I mean, that's only here on Earth, right? So if you're out in space, you've got almost everything is darkness, and then you got light and stars here and there. And there's no fighting between them. They just are, you know? It's like the star exists as a burning bright light in the midst of the dark, because that's what space is mostly dark. Yeah, the whole concept is sort of interesting way of anthropomorphizing the universe into a position where it's difficult for you to make choices or decisions in the moment and face reality as it is. So no matter how fantastic we are and how fantastic we become and how aware we are and how evolved we might be, we will always be somewhat limited because of the fact that we are in a biosphere that has its own rules, and and we base our understanding of reality on our environment. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just understanding that that's the case. Because to be able to experience in things different, to be able to dare to let go of these preconceived notions about reality and how it works, to have a magical experience or an encounter with a being that you didn't know could even exist, you have to be able to let go of that control of everything. The other side of that, of course, when we're talking about polarities, is there's the openness and then there's the discernment, because you have to determine what is safe for you, what is good for you, what is right for you. That doesn't necessarily mean that you are determining that for everyone. You're doing it for yourself, and that's another thing. Ego wants to be right for everyone. If you don't have ego running amok, it's okay for other people to think differently than you because they have different experiences of reality. They're in a different place. They're learning a different lesson, however you want to put it. It's like we're all focused on a slightly different spot in the universe. And yeah, so I think it's important to keep that in mind when we're walking this path. When you meet people that are absolutely certain that they know everything that's going on about everything that's happening out there and can just tell you what you should be doing with your life and so forth and not leave you room to decide for yourself, I think that's a danger sign, and that their ego is completely run amok, and you're best off to leave them in the dirt and go and find yourself somewhere else and, go sit on a pile of dirt and see what happens. Because you're more likely to get good information that way. But so that daring to look at the self and uncover those assumptions about reality leads to more experience, but then keeping some skepticism because without it being grounded in the reality that we do exist in, then it's useless. I mean, yeah, you can exist in an alternate state all the time and, have unicorns and rainbows and lights and angels and whatever walking around you, telling you things, engaging with you on a regular basis, but then you can't drive your car and you can't go grocery shopping and you can't cook your own food because you're so totally distracted by all this other stuff that's going on that you're experiencing, then it becomes useless for any development, really. And then you become a burden for other people to take care of. There are some great mystics that have become burdens for other people to take care of, that won't take care of themselves at all, and their followers have to take care of them, make sure that their body is clean and fed and all this other stuff, because they're off in their own universe doing their own thing. And it is obviously a very compelling and marvelous place that they're in, but really they can't communicate it, and they're not living in the world. Balance is what I'm after. So balance is definitely important when it comes to that. So just because you meet like even 1,000 people who all believe the same thing doesn't mean they actually know what's going on. That's another thing. It's like people have a tendency to collect together and reinforce one another's perceptions about reality and how it works based on whatever their experience happens to be. And you really see that in in vaccines, for example. For example, people can definitely believe that something that's not true is true because a whole bunch of people have decided that it is true, but it doesn't mean that it is actually true. So, for example, there's a lot of people that genuinely believe that a flu vaccine will give you the flu because they had a flu vaccine and then they got the flu. And even though there's no actual evidence to support the notion because there's no actual virus in a flu vaccine anymore, so there's no way for a shot to give you a disease, the specific disease in this case of the flu. Um, they've done the causation correlation equals causation in their head and says, okay, here you go. These two things are obviously connected. And then they meet other people who also believe these two things are obviously connected, and then no one can convince them otherwise. You can show them reports, you can tell them the science behind it, you can, and they think that they're lying about it because they just don't want people to know. And so then ego gets involved because they have made a commitment to an erroneous assumption that this is how the world works and this is their reality, and no one can talk them out of it because they're not willing to look at it. And that's another thing. That's the to dare thing, is to look at it and be willing to look at the assumption and then decide whether or not it's still worth your while or if it's time for it to go away. Um, so So that's part of the discernment, being able to check those things. And being open-minded when you're meeting the unknown is difficult. There's no doubt about it, because we have these notions in our head. So based upon what something looks like, we decide whether it's good or evil based on stories we've read about what good looks like and what evil looks like. So good is pleasing to the eye. It has a comforting feeling to it. It has some beauty or something like that. It's like, it looks more like us. So, that's our internal definition of beauty. If it has a sharp nose or sharp chin or sharp fingernails or cracked skin or looks like it's made from bark or has red eyes, all of these things are things that our culture collectively has decided indicates evil. And of course, if you're a tree spirit and this is how you look, well, you're being judged unfairly by how we perceive their essence and so forth, because it would be natural for a tree spirit to look like maybe bark and have angular parts to it, because trees are angular. They grow in different shapes and all this other stuff. And so that's another reason for challenging those assumptions about what is and what isn't beauty or good versus evil, and so forth. So let's see. So it doesn't matter what you believe in so much as it matters how you approach your beliefs, I guess, is really the upshot of that. Because if you approach your beliefs as something that is solidified and unchangeable and unchallengeable, then you're not going to be walking on this path, because you're not going to know yourself. And you're certainly not going to get to know the other parts of the universe that might exist outside of you, that are not you, that are not reflections of who you are or who you think you are or what you think should be out there. It's not an easy thing to do, to dare to be open to all those potentialities that are there. But you also don't want to be so far into all the different possibilities that are there that you lose complete focus and you have no way of navigating your life, because again, it's about balance. That's what the yin and yang is. It's about balance, or yin and yang. It's not about opposites opposing one another, but of the state of being transforming from one state to another and back. It's like everything is always in transition. The universe is in transition. Everything we see when we look out with our naked eye to the universe is light that is already extinguished and gone. We don't know what's actually out there right now because we are seeing into the past. We're not seeing reality as it is. So, it's like keeping that in mind when we're trying to figure stuff out and what to do, and being willing to make those mistakes as we go along and try things out. Try it out. If it works, great. Try it again. If it doesn't work, great. Maybe look at why it didn't work and try it a different way. Whatever it is. Um, so I guess that's probably about it for this at the moment. I'm looking forward to seeing what we want to talk about when we get together. And because you guys always bring up some interesting perspectives on everything. And I like that. And I like the fact that we're all different because that's definitely one of the things that makes life interesting and makes it more likely that I'm not stuck in my own head thinking everybody's like me. So, this is Siofra's Magick Alcove, and this has been Siofra Bradigan, blessed be.